I am Carrie Basas. I wanted to welcome you to our Zoom webinar. Today we're talking about accessibility together, and I'm joined by Ryan. Ryan, would you like to introduce yourself? And we will get going from there.
Yeah, my name is Ryan Leisinger. I work for the Office of Financial Management. I'm a solutions architect. My background in accessibility has been a lot in kind of the enterprise space. I worked for the Office of the Chief Information Officer on the statewide accessibility policy, which is Policy 188. And it's basically a policy to kind of bind the idea of IT and availability to individual disabilities, and that's kind of my background on accessibility.
Great. And today, as a webinar, we will leave time for questions, and there will be an opportunity to type them into the chat box. And if you would like to text them instead, and I will repeat this number later, you can text them to 206-430-0753. Ryan, would you like to talk a little bit about gatherings and set the tone?
Yeah, absolutely. So meetings, huddles, stand-ups, conferences, summits, forums, coffee lunches, gatherings are what people do. And I love this idea and how these things, how these pieces fit together, the accessibility, the access issues, and working through them and talking about them, and gatherings. And I use gatherings over meetings. I love this quote, but there's an amazing book called The Art of Gathering by Pira Parker. And it's the quote is, the way we gather matters. Gathering, the conscious bringing together of people for a reason, shapes the way we think, feel, and make sense of our world. And the image on the side of the slide is the cover of this book. And I start with this when we're talking about access and gatherings, because I like the human element that it brings right away into this conversation.
I think that's a really powerful way to think about how we create and shape events. So I want to talk a little bit about prioritizing access and belonging and why it matters. So about 20% of Washingtonians have disabilities. And when we think about disability, it's a range of disability and different life experiences. So sometimes we'll think about access as physical access or hearing access or being blind. But we also need to think about cognitive access, how approachable our methods are, how inclusive we are in our plain language, and how we invite people into the spaces, as Ryan mentioned, and psychological access. What is the experience of the environment for others? I want to talk a little bit about the access features of today's webinar. We're already having problems with one of them, and but I also want to share that access is always an invitation. To be honest, sometimes people think of it as a burden or something that they're going to mess up and they don't know what to do. And so they're not sure where to begin. And I'm hoping that our conversation today will lower some of those barriers and fears and really be a way that you can find a place to join in that. I was reading a book recently. It was called Care Work, Dreaming Disability Justice, and the author talks about access being a joy, because really it's an invitation to be in community with one another. And when we respond to the needs of everyone and think individually about people's experiences, then we realize that we have greater solidarity and we have better outcomes for other people, because we've brought very much a growth mindset and flexibility to the experience. We talk a bit about planning meetings. I mean, so many of our days in state government involve meeting planning. And there's this desire for a checklist or something else that we can turn to that will help us plan the perfect meeting when it comes to access for people with disabilities. Oftentimes, those checklists, despite our best efforts, are really focused on compliance. So Ryan and I know are both very passionate about bringing human-centered design and design thinking, which is something that we talk about a lot in state government as part of continuous improvement, to meetings and events and how we gather. Because design thinking is more inclusive, it's more focused on the human experience, and it's more substantive in how we welcome people into spaces and create spaces where people belong. So over on the right, you will see a diagram if you're joining us online, the Stanford D-School Design School's design thinking model, which some of you may be familiar with. And really the stages that that model goes through, and it's not linear, are empathizing, defining, ideating, prototyping, and testing. So we wanted to focus on two of those elements. Really, when we begin to think about access, we need to have empathy. And empathy means wanting to understand what the experience of this meeting, gathering is like for someone else. And it starts with a real passion and commitment, even if you're not sure how to begin or where to go further with your commitment to access, with a desire to be inclusive and really wanting everyone there to belong and creating spaces for leadership from people with disabilities and feedback loops. And then you need to prototype and test. What does this feel like? And we think about prototyping as, do we need to have a meeting before a meeting? I mean, we're gonna double our time. But really prototyping is often an experience of trying your best, thinking about these best practices that we will discuss, and then learning from the mistakes and realizing that we're all learning together, and that people, when they see that you're trying, will give you some grace and understand that there's trust and there is empathy. We can also think about getting feedback in advance of a meeting or a gathering. We'll provide some examples of what that might look like in an invitation, and then be open to learning in the moment. And it's just that commitment going on in the process of wanting to improve each time, even if it might feel incremental. There are many different definitions of disability. So one, in thinking about in meeting planning, is thinking about people with disabilities having a mismatch between their abilities and the environment. And we know that many of these perceptions and experiences of disability and ability are socially constructed, and they come with bias in mind. But when we're thinking about meetings, one thing to hold at the center is that one thing that can fundamentally shift meetings, and I say this as a person with a disability, is realizing that so many of our spaces and meetings are not inclusive in the planning with people with disabilities, and so their experience can be less than what we hope for. And that's where we see barriers pop up in that initial design, where when we go back historically, people with disabilities were not necessarily in those spaces because of social isolation and exclusion. So this is really an opportunity to think about disability inclusion as moving towards being more inclusive as the whole. Would you add anything, Ryan?
Yeah, I think the mismatch definition is important in this part of the work. When we think about disability as being an index and not being this on or off or compliance or non-compliance or this it's not always a steady state of what it is. It can change from minute to minute, from hour to hour, from day to day, and this idea when we're talking about the design thinking aspect of thinking of it of this mismatch between the ability and the environment. And that's that the environment wasn't created with them in mind. It's not a match, and I think that is an important definition to hold in this space.
I agree. And one of the opportunities there is to bring closer alignment with the experiences of people with disabilities. And I come from a law background and also in higher education. I've had many conversations with colleagues who are really interested, like, hey, is there a spreadsheet or a chart? I have someone who has epilepsy who's coming to my meeting, or I have someone who has a hearing impairment, or I have someone who's blind. really open-hearted, tell me what to do. And it is that individual and varying experience that you're talking about, which can be overwhelming for people, but is so important to acknowledge in that mix that you're responding to people's needs that they're identifying, and that they are experts in helping you make that progress towards being more inclusive. I mean, certainly there are some best practices and some legal requirements, but there are the other pieces that that you benefit from being in relationship with people and learning from them. So Ryan, I know you're going to talk a little bit about the Americans with Disabilities Act as a civil rights law, and what this means.
Yeah, so this slide has a photo on the right-hand side from 1990 when the Department of Justice signed the ADA into law. It's the representatives holding up their T-shirts. We have to talk about ADA when we're talking about kind of the foundational piece of what drives this compliance idea. And the responsibilities for Title II, state and local government, and then Title III, the public accommodations for commercial facilities. And we can go back there and reference this, but this is a civil rights law. It's prohibiting discrimination, and it is this underlying piece that we need to talk about when we're in this work. It's getting maybe away from the human aspect a little bit to some degree, but as a state government worker and as someone running a public commercial facility, we have to be able to talk about this and understand what it is. This is the compliance aspect, and this is the piece that we kind of dig into it at that level.
So I see that over on the right, you've provided the 2010 ADA standards for accessible design. And we know that there are other regulations and guidance materials for various requirements under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Do you want to talk a little bit about what people might find in these design standards from 2010?
Yeah. So I'll do this presentation sometimes, and I'll actually have a printed out version of the 170 pages printed front and back of this guide. And it doesn't necessarily provide these direct solutions. It's lots of, once you kind of get through the text of it, it's lots of images of doorways and bathroom stalls and measurements and these kind of things. This is important. This influences architectural decisions and building codes. This helps with some standards about how to design space in this way. But this isn't a document that you would pull out to be in compliance. With it's not a very human document. And it's great stuff, and there's material in there, and like I said, there's pieces in there that are valuable, and to understand it exists if you're speaking with facilities, but it's not this necessarily human designed element that I'm kind of looking for. I've looked through a bunch of it to kind of learn some of the different aspects of it. It's available for a free download, but it's a standard document. It's not actually giving you like direct solutions. It's kind of giving you ideas of how to get around these pieces and also things to look for if you're doing a walkthrough of a space or something.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about those pieces as we give some examples in this webinar. Clearly, we could spend a lot of time just digging into one aspect of that 170-page manual, and then there are all the other pieces that it didn't anticipate. So Ryan and I acknowledge for our talk about human-centered design that people do need a place to begin, and our office at the Governor's Office of the Education Ombuds took accessibility checklists and toolkits designed by people with disabilities in various communities and distilled them down. So we have a 4-pager. You've received a link to that in your webinar registration and reminder email today. So that's available to you. And Our office is also really interested in co-design with communities, and we have a quick start guide as well as a more research-heavy guide to co-design. And I also want to share, when we think about access, and this has been a really valuable conversation for me to have with communities of color and immigrant and refugee communities. Think about my own positionality as a woman with disability. People make the connections with language access for families or students for whom English is not their primary language. And that's a really important connection to make. And we also have to acknowledge that deaf and hard of hearing people use ASL as a language. And we'll talk a little bit more about interpretation. I'm hoping our closed captioning will come online as we go. But that resource, language access, we have incorporated both disability and deaf language access, as well as access for individuals where English is not their primary language. Going back to the accessibility events checklist, just the main categories there, if you're interested in digging in, are venue site visit, planning, promotion, day of. It's really anticipating that this will be an event in person, but many of these things apply to online meetings or phone meetings, and then what to do after the event so that you can continue to learn and improve as you go. The other checklist that we have provided here, guide, is from Disability Rights Washington's Event Accessibility Guide, and it's quite helpful as well, and that came from an organization of people with disabilities, so it was really designed from that perspective of living through events and meetings that may not have met their needs very well.
Before we had started this, I hadn't seen the Quick Start co-design document, and before we had started working on this, and I think that's such a great document. I think there's so many valuable pieces in there, and definitely recommend it.
Great, thanks. We're always trying to distill how that human-centered element comes up, and we continue to learn from our failures as well as our misses and near misses and successes and positive feedback that we get. So we've talked a little bit about how overwhelming it can be to get started, or people not feeling competent or confident in really doing this well. And I love the quote from earlier at the beginning of this webinar. So can you talk a little bit about starting at the beginning and what that looks like as people are doing their planning?
Yeah, as I mentioned, I worked on the accessibility policy for the state of Washington, and quite quickly I realized and learned and listened, I had to start making more accessible events, not necessarily something that was high on my radar when I really first started to dig into it, not, learning my audience and working kind of through the policy aspect. And with a little experience, I started to understand how important the invitation is, how important that first contact, that first initial part of setting the story, setting the tone. You're normalizing access by making your invitation accessible. And the things that I kind of start to learn and talk to people about was even the platform that I'm using. If it's an event scheduling platform, looking into the accessibility of it, how does that work? Concepts for government like plain talk and just simplifying. Quick tips are contrast. Contrast is a huge issue on the web and in design aspect, and making it so your text is as readable as possible. If you have graphics, making sure that you don't have text on graphics that's not also related in the text of the document. Buttons being very clear, links being very clear, and just the idea of you get this ability to kind of invite and impress on someone for the first time. You only really get that once. And if we pack that with as much accessibility as possible, we're normalizing access. We're saying that we are open for this conversation going forward.
Yeah, I think there's so much that we can learn from data as we were talking about. And there are aspects of access that come up as people share their needs. One big emerging area of access is being scent or fragrance free, and really having people understand what that means. It's not about I smell good. It's really thinking about what things am I wearing, bringing into the space that are giving off a scent that could be neurologically triggering for someone else, whether they have lived with cancer or they have migraines or some other disability where that becomes problematic. I was sharing with Ryan in our prep call that I've gone to the University of Washington to the D Center, which is the identity center for students with disabilities. And I've been greeted by little medicine cups of scent-free soap, where you're invited to go in the bathroom and not only do better for those who have immune deficiencies, but also try to get off some of the scent that we gather from our hand sanitizers, the regular bathroom soap that could be triggering for people in that D-center space. So it's a welcome, it's a greeting, it's a much different welcome and greeting than you expect, but it signals from the very beginning that we are serious about this space and we're helping you do it. So we're not washing your clothes with something that's scent-free, and we're not keeping you at the door from coming in, but we're showing you the small things that we can do that are very low cost, but mean a whole lot. And over here on the right, you have an ask and invitations, because people are always asking me, what do we say? And so I think it really is important to have language like that in talking about for questions about event access or to request accommodations, please contact, and to provide your name versus, a large office. Contact any of OEO. We're only 7 people, but whom within OEO, and a phone number, and realizing that not everyone is going to call, that it might be preferable for them to email or communicate that way. If you are using TTY or some other system, then you can add that number as well. And providing a deadline for notification for access requests. So we'll talk a little bit about this later, but you want to make sure that you have the best people on your team for access support that you can, and that you've had a chance to think through all of those pieces rather than scurrying at the last minute.
And I've included that the language in meetings within our agency and within my teams. And I've had people request that if I was going to bring a handout or a print, that it'd be larger text. And I wouldn't have known that before, and maybe they wouldn't even have thought to ask before they were invited to ask in that space. So I like that. That's the simplicity of that. It can be that simple. It can be, there can be a lot more to it. But the idea is that in this invitation, how can we make it as open as possible?
And I think there's another piece there. I know that I have gone to events which have been hosted by other people. And sometimes when you're going to an event that's hosted by other people, I will be on autopilot. So I'm thinking at times that they're taking care of those things. And I think it's okay to set expectations, or at the very minimum to ask, are there any access needs that I should be aware of in coming to your event to present? And because you don't want to be in that situation where you go and you realize that you've only brought printed handouts of a certain size, or that you haven't been thoughtful or have enough insights into how to structure activities and interactions. And that's been really helpful. And I think it's also opened up and normalized a dialogue where people ask me in return, is there anything we can do to support you? And so that's really creating a space, even amongst strangers that have only communicated by email or by phone. How do we make this a good experience for you and make it useful for the people that will be receiving that information or sharing information with you about their experiences in our work in public school? So here, I know we're moving into a section of the presentation where you're sharing some diagrams and some other quick tips thinking about space and communication.
Yeah, so this slide is access in space. The image on the slide is a pretty technical diagram of some doorways and some measurements and some heights and widths. And the point of that I have for me is that uh, part of inclusion is recognizing exclusion. And to me, increased access is often recognizing barriers. And we do need to learn what these are. And the idea behind this is to do a walkthrough and understand the space that you are working in, and most likely go physically occupy it, because you will notice things. And if you start to understand what the different things that we need to look at. It's approach and entrance, the access to goods and services, the toilet rooms. And if all the bathrooms are have been approved for ADA, or if there's a bathroom that's intended for that use differently, and just know where these things are, because what you're doing is you're filling yourself up, or you're filling your team up with the information that you will need to support the people at your event. And just to know where these things are and understand them. If there's a more barrier-free way to enter a building, suggest it. Make it part of your communication that there is an easier way, or there is a better way of access for something like that. Equivalent and easy access is part of providing access. So knowing the space and being able to communicate it and meet the need is I think a very important piece. And I think you really only get that from having gone there, moved through it, have some idea of what you're looking for. And again, this gets into an area that a checklist does become a very helpful tool, because what you're doing is you're understanding where you are in the space, and understanding maybe some of the requirements. I don't take a tape measure with me when I go and do this to measure the different aspects. I'm looking and watching and trying to kind of think of these aspects and how they all work together. But what I'm trying to do is understand the space that I'm asking people to come share with me for an event.
Yeah, what I found really helpful is if people have already been in that space that have disabilities, asking them what their experience of it is like. And it could be people with disabilities who are not necessarily coming to your event, but if people are willing to take the time to share that information, that's great. And one thing that comes up when we're working with community partners, whether they have disabilities or not, is providing that additional information. We can assume, for example, when we have a meeting in Olympia for state agencies, there's often the assumption that people are going to be walking across campus. Well, people get around in different ways, and people may be coming in from outside Olympia. You may have guest speakers or customers or stakeholders who are attending. It might be a public meeting in which there are others who are coming in, and you may not anticipate who those others are. And so to what extent can you provide information about public transportation, bus stops? Take that into consideration when you're planning. If you are set on which spaces are available to you, can you point people to the parking lots? Can you provide a map? And I think the other piece with thinking about access in space is we can pick a space that is accessible. Someone says, this is a brand new building. We've checked, we've done an accessibility check. I mean, we should always know that brand new doesn't necessarily mean compliance with the ADA or truly accessible. But let's say that we do know that. You've covered that baseline of compliance. Well, we can always do something as humans to change the space. So what have I done with the tables? I know you're gonna talk about room layout and provide a diagram in the next slide, so I'll move on to that. But what have I done as a human to interfere with accessibility of that space? And am I making use of all of the accessible features of that space, or am I willing to bring in something, as well as we'll talk about with presentations, shift my behavior and how I do things too? Because having that physically accessible space is fundamental. But it's just one of the first steps to really thinking about an inclusive experience.
Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. And so the next slide starts to talk specifically kind of about the space and several issues. I use this diagram. This diagram is from Results Washington and Office of Financial Management, and I use it to display. It's a kind of a technical diagram of a room with the doors mapped out and the tables, and then there's some highlighted areas, and the different highlighted areas are actually saying this would be a preferred place or a place that may work better with access or maybe a wheelchair access to it, or they've marked out where maybe the video would be there'd be less glare, or there's a little better contrast, knowing that the room changes. And they also marked out areas for audio, and the audio is actually louder, they've determined, in these areas. All of those technical details are very specific to this room and don't apply to everything. But what I liked is that they thought about it. And I liked that they presented this as, we have considered the mismatch. We have considered the space and how it works together. And that's seating, visual, audio, line of sight, screen glare, dim and bright, LED and fluorescent lighting is a one. Again, the scent-free ideas that kind of work into these different ideas of access. And I use this diagram to talk about that because I just loved that they thought about it this much, and they were willing to include this in their invitation or include this in additional information to the people attending and say, we have thought about this. Is it a direct fit for everyone's ability? I don't know. They didn't know, but the consideration of it tells me that they're thinking about it, and they're open to suggestions in that space.
And I also, this is a beautiful diagram that we have on the left. And at the same time, I think that people should feel free to jump in where they can with doing that. Whether it involves taking out a cocktail napkin or, moving around things on a table in miniature, or having people stand at the back of the room to see what the experience is like, or sit down and see if people could see the display screen behind them in that position, depending on where they were, is really important. So it can be a rough sketch and a rough walkthrough as a starting place. And then another thing or tip that I've heard from disabled speakers, and I should say here, language is often an issue that comes out with disabilities. So you will hear both person first language, which is people with disabilities, and then often within the disability rights community, we will refer to ourselves as disabled or autistic. And that's a conversation for another day, but in case you wonder why I flip-flop between language, that comes up. So as another speaker or presenter identifies as being a disabled woman, she has shared that she often invites people to rearrange the space in the way they need. And I know for people who have arranged the space in a really lovely manner, that seems like chaos will ensue. But really, people appreciate that invitation. They're not going to mess with your beautiful tables and necessarily create access problems for other people. It just allows them, and it provides a welcome individually and in the beginning of starting something to say, move around. No one's going to judge you for that. You can shift this 12 inches, or you can take out this chair, or maybe you need more elbow room and the chairs are locked together. And that's fine. And if someone else has an issue with that, or it's impeding their access, they can share that as well, because you've told people that do what you need to do to take care of yourself during this time. So we can talk a bit about audio, and I see that we don't yet have our closed captions up. So I know we're still working on that.
So yeah, the second space slide is audio. And audio, if you've ever done video production or any kind of video pieces, we always, in that space, you're always saying that audio is, 90% of video. If the audio is clear, if you can hear, if that kind of communication is happening, that you're getting so much. So I think of audio a lot when I'm in the space, and always where I try to go back to is use a microphone in a public address system. How many times have we heard my voice carries? I can talk loud. I've said it myself. I can talk loud. But what we're doing there is we're excluding the ability to amplify and even to kind of add layers onto that. The technology now is at a point where I was at a conference last week, and the gentleman carries his own basically transmitter system with him, that the audio system, they just have to plug it in and it works for him. It's a personal transmitter system. We went in 10 minutes before the event and he got plugged in and it worked wonderfully for him. And this technology exists, and if we're not using a PA system and we don't get the benefits of that. The other pieces that I add to that is lip reading. Many individuals are dependent on lip reading or use it as a high level to kind of understand, and that's you know, turning your face towards the speakers and speaking clearly. And then in this space, we have to talk about American Sign Language interpreters. And that ADA does reference the quote unquote effective communication and gives a definition of that. So that is covered in ADA. And there's different conversations about how much and how, when, and how many people and all these different pieces. But if we're talking about human design, let's understand the ability to provide that language service and make it available. Again, for this one, the slide on the right-hand side, the fact of piece is that we're talking about 20% of Americans experience hearing loss, 50 million plus people. So this is a huge population, and it's an index. It's not on or off. And this simple idea of working on your audio and promoting good audio in your space is, I think, very, very valuable and something to very much consider. And this is for all your users and all of their abilities.
Yeah, I think about the gender and culture piece that come into this as well, where we're privileging people who are louder, and they may be people who are from dominant culture or men. And also in communicating that people are just going to have to move closer, or the speaker will be louder. We're kind of shutting down the welcome to share what those needs are for hearing, because it seems like if you try harder, you'll be able to hear. Or if the speaker tries harder, they will be able to share that. So if it's just the baseline, and I've had friends ask me, well, gosh, like, you know, we meet in the basement of a church for our professional organization, or I don't know what space I'm going to be going into. It's just a conference room in a co-working space, and I don't know that they're going to be set up. And like you said, there can be some transportable, low-cost things to take with you. Our office recently bought a karaoke machine, and I was joking that I'm not going to have the rainbow flashing lights on. That may pose other problems for people, and it's not as professional. But you're talking about something that's $100, and we haven't used it yet for karaoke as a team, but it's really for access, and any of us could take it somewhere. You know, so it tucks in your car. If you're going to carry in highlighters and Post-its and handouts, it's just another thing to bring with you. And that way you're not dependent on the space to build that in. But most spaces you're having larger public meetings do have that. And if you ask them and they don't have it, you're also signaling to them that's important and something that they should work on. So that becomes the baseline for other people using that space. So we're going to talk about presentation, and over on the right, Ryan has provided this, they're stick figures, they're very cute. It's a number of them of different ages, and they are flashing and moving around. So I think what we're trying to convey there is that your audience could be anyone. And so you don't always know that in advance, and how do you roll with it? And some of that is planning in advance, but you will discover in the midst of doing something that perhaps there is a different way to do that, or you may discover after the event that this was not a complete success for those who participated. So I have seen events where people are very thoughtful in the planning, the organizers, the space is accessible, we have the microphone, and then a presenter who is not used to doing their work in an accessible way or thinking about access and presentations can undermine that, not intentionally, but it's through their actions. So once again, it's our human behavior and what we bring to it. And sometimes, there's a little prep in education for those of you who have had some experience and learned along the way that you can share with others that are coming into your space about what you value when it comes to access. So you're not shaming anyone, you're just communicating, and this becomes more of a baseline for them too. So thinking about presentations, interactions, and exercises, you want to consider the audience, and you're going to work the work you're doing should include asking the audience to say their names before speaking. This is invaluable on a conference call. We know for all of us, especially the state work groups that we may be on, I don't often know who's speaking. And if you can't see them, or you're joining by a number of mixed modalities, including video call, I don't know who's adding what, and therefore I don't know whose perspective is being shared. If there is someone who's providing access, whether it's a personal care attendant who's assisting somebody with a physical disability, for example, or it's an interpreter, ASL or another language, in these situations, they're both good lessons. Speak to the person and not their assistant. And you want to ask the audience to verbally and physically raise their hands to be counted or expressed. If you have a participant, like I was doing a panel last week where one of the panelists was deafblind, we had a conversation with the interpreters in advance. How should I know, or how would I know that you want to participate at this point? And then what can others do to shape their behavior? So you're not the only one kind of sticking out with this. So is there a way that we all feel comfortable in this panel that is accessible for saying, I'm up, I want to share information about this or answer that question? You should be ready to alter exercises to be inclusive. Describing your slides, images, in your presentations, which is something that takes practice. And I know Ryan and I have both said we were going to prompt each other to do that today. So I think we've done okay with that so far. Using plain talk, as Ryan mentioned, sometimes we'll send out invitations and I have no idea if I'm supposed to be there. And if I'm there, who's inviting me? What am I supposed to do? What would I take out of this? Do I have to prepare? And so all of us had those experiences, whether it's a barrage of acronyms, just providing some really simple context, understanding if there's something in there, if there's an action item, making it very clear. So these are really best practices in how we communicate with one another, disabilities or not. Allowing the audience to see your faces, Ryan mentioned, and taking breaks. Now, so I will say I was recently at an accessibility event, which was amazing. And the irony was there were no breaks built in. And we tell one another that you can take a break and we're not going to judge you for taking a break. But it's a real difference to provide breaks, because then you're encouraging people to take breaks at the same time. The people who need to take care of whatever needs they have can at any point, you can signal that, but really just having some pause, letting people process things, and it gives people an opportunity to be in relationship with one another too. I know we want to leave some time for questions, so I will go through these next two slides and highlight. Ryan, I know this is going to be a big piece for you. So people often want to know, how do I make presentations like PowerPoints more accessible? And know that there are resources at the state level. And make sure, I've seen this happen, if you have videos embedded in your PowerPoints, that they have captions. Make sure you have large print with high contrast, which is what we did today. You don't have to have a presentation that is black and gray and has no images. Select images, as you were saying, Ryan, that communicate the information that you want to share, that add value. And then to the extent possible, I think this is a huge thing. You were talking about multiple formats, but being ready to provide materials in advance is key. It helps all of us, but if there is something that someone wants to download into their phone or personal computer to use their accessibility tools, so they're not dependent on the screen or the speaker, that's great to have. If they need time to process because they know they're going to participate in a discussion, or they just need to look up some things because maybe there hasn't been plain talk or there won't in the presentation. These are all times, or to anticipate the scheduling of things. So it really helps for people, supporting people with a variety of disabilities. So do you want to briefly go over how someone might check the accessibility in PowerPoint?
Yeah, so PowerPoint 2016 and the online PowerPoint through 065, the online version, they both have accessibility checkers. They're in slightly different positions. One is in this check issues box from the file menu. I suggest you Google it if you kind of are looking for it. And then there's another one on the 0365 that's under review. But maybe this is where I get into the idea of normalizing this kind of stuff. I did a presentation yesterday, and I told them that I wouldn't give them my slide deck to distribute until I went back and checked the accessibility for it. Just make this your normal part of quality control in a presentation like this. Things to expect, things you're going to encounter are the descriptions on your images, contrast issues. Every slide needs an individual unique name, and then you'll read something. Sometimes you'll run into the read order of your slide will be challenged by the system. This doesn't mean we've removed all the access barriers of your slides, but what this means to me is that you've thought about it enough to go through and do these checks and kind of use the technology that's available to you to move you forward in it. And if you're a state employee, there is a LMS course available that I would recommend. It's 7-10 minutes long. You could check it out for PowerPoint. And if not, that's the same content is available on Microsoft's site.
And Microsoft, I know many of us use Microsoft products, and Microsoft has an accessibility help desk. It's not only for people with disabilities, it's for people who are supporting and allies to people with disabilities. So I have some friends who work there, and they're happy to receive questions and provide that additional support because it is their products that many of us are using. So treat that as a community resource as well. Before we take questions, I want to share. So we're thinking also about communication access and hearing access. You'll see an image over on the left where there's a speaker and there is an ASL interpreter right next to the speaker. They're almost shoulder to shoulder. And then over on the screen is the CART. So it's live captions or communication access and real-time translation. So what the speaker is saying is being typed, and that's displayed on the screen. And a couple tips with working with sign language interpreters is to realize that, or tactile interpreters, is helping presenters know how to work with interpreters, including the earlier etiquette about speaking to the person who is hard of hearing or deaf, as well as pacing the presentation to meet the interpreter's needs, and sharing the space with the interpreter. Many of us are not used to having somebody right next to us when we're presenting. So the time shouldn't be spent kind of tripping over the interpreter and making note of the interpreter being there. You're not co-presenting, they're facilitating access. So I've seen that. And sometimes people who will be presenting just need a heads up, and they may need a bit of crash course or education about that. So be willing to provide a resource to them, or including a fact sheet, a deaf and hard of hearing organization, or just someone in the office who's done this before. And also you got to book in advance. You have to get feedback and things can go wrong. So make sure that you've got a plan for that. We believe in collecting and improving on our work, and we have a SurveyMonkey link there, as well as on the right you'll see an image, an orange image, which looks like the universal disability symbol of a person seated in a chair, but the chair has been turned into a heart. So really thinking about disability access as love and community. We have the slides online, and we also will have the video with captions posted within 3 to 5 days. So I wanted in the last few minutes to go to some of the questions that we might have that maybe we can answer. So if anybody has questions that they want to ask. So CART is now available, sorry I didn't see that earlier, at the link, and will be added to the recording after. And then we had been broadcasting on a YouTube channel. So I apologize for that delay with that. What questions could we answer in our remaining few minutes about access? You can text me at 206-430-0753, or you can write a message in the chat box, or you could, those are probably the two best ways to do so. So someone asked about what are some examples of welcoming language. I think providing that statement that you offered, Ryan, about, we're here, tell us what your access needs are, and really making it open versus defensive, like, saying something like, we have a limited budget, we may or may not be able to do it. Not qualified, you can have that conversation with someone later, but really giving them a point of contact. What other suggestions might you have?
I like the simplicity of that language. I like how it is an invitation to everyone if they need some sort of accommodation. My experience is that the individuals who will benefit greatly or will benefit from an accommodation, they will tell you, they will be direct. But there's something about just opening yourself up and saying, I'm willing to work on this for everyone in my audience. And that is, I like that language. And I think also just establishing these norms and including anything you can. If there's a easier way to get into the building in the description or the directions, if, for instance, that, a cart would be provided or something to that degree, just including that in the invite, not even pulling it out separately or making making a deal of it. Just it's part of the invite.
And we got a message from Scott McCallum at the Washington State School for the Blind, and I would say this about the Center for Childhood Deafness and Hearing Loss, which I know is changing its name, that they are resources too. I have worked with students from the School for the Blind to give us feedback on the accessibility of our website. I would never assume that people with disabilities should do things for free when it comes to access, but the students were really great in thinking about a student-centered perspective for that. One quick last question, I'll let you answer this, Ryan, if you can. What kind of response would you recommend to patrons who complain about accessibility features, such as lights being used to follow along with the script if you're in a theater, or other things? Like, if you have an issue, if an issue is directed at you, or you personally have an issue because of your access needs, what's the best way to start that conversation and address it?
I think that sincere, open listening, that taking in the feedback, explaining how you're going to act on it, what you're going to do to go forward with it, and then you have to act on it. That was that last slide of receiving feedback and acting on it. Personal follow-up is this huge thing. I've had people attend events and give me feedback on them. Maybe they never attended another event, but I actually followed up with them at a later date and said, I've actually added this to my future classes or events that I'm doing, to let them know that feedback was valuable, that it was used, and that it actually made the overall, it made my work better in that way. And it's such a huge thing. I think of myself, just if I have feedback for someone, what it means if they follow up, if they listen, if it's taken into consideration. And that's just such a huge piece.
So I know we're going to wrap up, and I thank you so much. And our email addresses are on the slides, but I'll also give you our office email, which is OEOINFO, so OEOinfo @gov.wa.gov. And we have some additional questions over in our webinar chat panel, and we'll respond to those by email. And quick closing out tip, I would recommend 10 days to 2 weeks, which is one of those questions for providing access or requesting notice of accessibility needs. And do you have anything else you'd like to say before we wrap up our webinar, Ryan?
One of the largest things I've learned for putting on events is to be prepared for the unexpected and have as many of these things in place as possible. The only way I've learned these is by doing events and learning the process of them and learning what to expect. Don't not do it because of concerns in these kind of areas. Just work to provide the most barrier-free experience possible.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for people for being gracious and standing by with some of the tech issues today. And feel free to reach out to us with feedback or questions. We're happy to be a resource for you, and we can point you in the direction of others who feel the same way. Take care. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.